Ava stood at the edge of the schoolyard, her fingers nervously picking at the frayed edge of her hoodie sleeves. She always watched from a distance, just out of sight, like a shadow in her own life. 14 years old and practically invisible, she was the kind of girl people only noticed when they wanted to make fun of her. Her long brown hair hung like a curtain around her face, and she slouched her thin frame in a way that made her seem even smaller. The lunchtime bell rang, and as usual, Ava walked toward her solitary bench beneath the oak tree at the far end of the yard. It was her safe space. There, she could quietly eat her lunch and dream about a day when she wouldn't feel so out of place, when maybe, just maybe, she could make friends and fit in. But not today. As soon as Ava sat down, Lila and her gang of followers spotted her. Lila was the queen bee of the school, tall, blonde, and always surrounded by a swarm of girls who hung onto her every word. She was everything Ava wasn't: popular, outgoing, and confident. "Well, look who it is, Ava the ghost," Lila called out, her voice cutting through the noise of the playground like a blade. Ava's heart sank. She stared down at her sandwich, hoping, praying, that if she didn't respond, Lila would just move on. But ignoring Lila never worked. "What's the point of coming to school if you're just going to hide all day? Oh, wait, you don't have any friends, do you?" Lila's voice oozed with mockery, and the girls behind her burst into laughter. Ava's face burned with embarrassment. She tried to shrink even further into herself, her hands trembling as she held her lunch tray. She felt like a small animal caught in a trap, unable to escape, unable to fight back. And then, Lila took it further. She reached down and snatched Ava's sandwich from her hands. With a smirk, she tossed it onto the ground, mashing it into the dirt with her foot. "Oops! Looks like your lunch is as invisible as you are." The girls laughed again, their voices echoing around the yard, drawing the attention of other students who watched, but said nothing. Ava's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She bit her lip, hard enough to keep from crying. The humiliation weighed down on her, making her feel smaller than ever. Without a word, Ava gathered her backpack and walked away. She had learned a long time ago that fighting back only made things worse. Better to keep her head down, stay quiet, and let the storm pass. But that storm wasn't going to pass this time. It was only getting started. The bullying didn't stop after that day. In fact, it got worse. Every day, Ava became the target of Lila's cruel jokes. Whether it was knocking her books out of her hands, spilling drinks on her in the cafeteria, or whispering nasty comments just loud enough for her to hear, it felt like there was no escape. The worst part wasn't even the words. It was the looks from everyone else. The pity from some, the amused smirks from others, and worst of all, the silence of those who just watched, too afraid to stand up for her. Ava's grades began to slip. She could barely focus in class anymore, constantly waiting for the next cruel prank or snide comment. She started eating her lunch in the bathroom, huddled in a stall with her knees to her chest, away from the prying eyes of the cafeteria. At home, she stayed in her room, avoiding her parents' concerned questions. One afternoon during gym class, things took a darker turn. The dreaded day had come: dodgeball. Ava hated dodgeball more than any other game. She wasn't athletic, and she knew that gym class was just another opportunity for her to be targeted. As the teams were picked, Ava stood off to the side, hoping not to be noticed. But, of course, Lila noticed. She always noticed. "Hey, let's make this fun," Lila called out, tossing a ball in the air. "Let's see if we can knock out the ghost first." The words sent a chill down Ava's spine, but before she could react, the first rubber ball came flying at her. She dodged it by inches, but the next one hit her square in the chest, knocking her backward. The force of the final throw sent her crashing to the gym floor, the sting of the ball still burning on her skin. Laughter erupted around the gym, loud and cruel. Lila high-fived her friends, grinning as if she had won a championship. Ava stayed on the floor for a moment, her knees scraped, her pride shattered. That was when something inside her snapped. As she pushed herself up, Ava's fists clenched, and a new sensation flooded through her: anger. The laughter around her seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of her pulse in her ears. She couldn't take it anymore. She had spent her whole life being quiet, being invisible. But now she was done. "They pushed me too far," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely a whisper. But inside, it felt like a roar. That night, Ava lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was racing, replaying the humiliation she had endured that day and every day before it. The shame, the anger, the helplessness, it all churned inside her like a storm, refusing to let her rest. And then a thought crossed her mind. What if I didn't let them push me anymore? The idea was terrifying. Standing up to Lila and her friends seemed impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more the fear turned into something else: determination. Ava wasn't going to let them walk all over her anymore. She wasn't going to be the girl who was laughed at and pushed around. It was time to take control. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Ava made a decision. She threw on a pair of old sneakers, tied her hair back, and quietly slipped out of the house. She ran through the neighborhood, her feet pounding the pavement, her breath ragged. She wasn't fast, and she wasn't strong, but she pushed herself harder with each step, fueled by the frustration and anger that had been building inside her for so long. After her morning runs, Ava would spend hours watching online videos about self-defense and strength training. She was determined to become stronger, not just physically, but mentally. Every day after school, she would hit the local boxing gym, where she trained in secret. She started by hitting the punching bag lightly, but as the weeks passed, her punches grew stronger, faster. Each punch was fueled by the faces of the kids who had tormented her, by the laughter she had endured, and by the fear she had always carried with her. In the gym, Ava found something she had never felt before: power. Every drop of sweat, every bruise on her knuckles was a reminder that she wasn't helpless. She could change things. She could fight back. But Ava kept her transformation hidden. No one at school knew what she was doing. On the outside, she was still the quiet girl, the invisible one. But inside, she was becoming someone else entirely. Someone stronger. Someone who wasn't afraid anymore. As the weeks went by, Ava waited for the right moment to reveal her newfound strength. And that moment came sooner than she expected. It was the school's annual field day, the event that everyone looked forward to. One of the biggest competitions was the obstacle course, a grueling race that required speed, strength, and endurance. Lila had won the race for the past 3 years in a row, and she strutted around the field that morning like she already had the trophy in her hands. Ava watched from the sidelines, her stomach churning with anticipation. She had trained for this. She knew she could win, but she also knew what would come next. Winning meant drawing attention, and that was something Ava had always avoided. But not today. Today, she wasn't going to stay invisible. When the whistle blew to signal the start of the race, Ava hung back, letting Lila and her friends get ahead. She watched as they struggled with the first few obstacles, climbing walls, crawling through mud pits, and balancing on narrow beams. Lila's cocky smile faltered as she realized the course was harder than she remembered. And that's when Ava made her move. With a burst of energy, she sprinted forward, her legs pumping like pistons as she flew through the obstacles. Her months of training had paid off. She climbed the walls with ease, her body moving with a strength and agility she had never had before. The other students watched in shock as Ava, the quiet girl they had always ignored, began to overtake Lila and her friends. By the time Ava reached the final obstacle, a massive rope climb, she was in the lead. Lila was still struggling at the bottom of the rope, her face twisted with frustration. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't catch up. With one final pull, Ava reached the top of the rope and rang the bell, signaling her victory. The crowd erupted into cheers. For the first time in her life, Ava wasn't invisible. She wasn't the quiet girl who let people push her around. She was a fighter, a warrior. The students who had once mocked her were now cheering for her. Even the teachers who had turned a blind eye to the bullying for so long looked at her with newfound respect. But Ava didn't need their approval. She had found something much more important: her own strength. Lila, still panting at the bottom of the rope, looked up at Ava with disbelief. The girl she had spent years tormenting had just beaten her, fair and square. There was nothing she could say, no cruel joke that could take away Ava's victory. As Ava climbed down from the rope, the students surrounded her, clapping and cheering. For once, they weren't laughing at her. They were celebrating her. But as she walked through the crowd, Ava noticed something else. Lila, standing off to the side, her face flushed with embarrassment and defeat. Ava could have gloated. She could have rubbed her victory in Lila's face, the way Lila had done to her so many times before. But instead, Ava walked up to her and said something that Lila never expected. "It doesn't feel good, does it?" Lila's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Ava gave her a small smile, one that wasn't mocking, but understanding. "You don't have to be like this, you know. You can change." And with that, Ava walked away, her head held high. She had won, not just the race, but something much bigger. She had proven to herself, and to everyone else, that she wasn't someone to be pushed around. Word of Ava's victory spread quickly through the school. Lila and her gang no longer held the same power over the other students. People started talking about how cruel bullying could be, and for the first time, teachers began addressing it openly. Ava's strength and kindness had sparked a change, not just in herself, but in the entire school. As the days passed, Ava noticed something strange. Lila was no longer the loud, confident leader of her group. She had become quieter, more reserved, as if she was starting to realize that her bullying hadn't made her stronger. It had only made her feel weaker. One day, as Ava sat at her usual spot under the oak tree, she was surprised to see Lila walk up to her, alone. There was no smirk on her face, no group of girls laughing behind her. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ava looked up, surprised, but she saw something in Lila's eyes that she had never expected: regret. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting you," Lila continued. I guess I was just trying to make myself feel better by making you feel worse." Ava considered her words for a moment before nodding. "It's not easy being different," she said, "but that doesn't give anyone the right to make others feel small." Lila looked down at her feet, fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. "I'm trying to be better." Ava smiled softly. "That's a good start." And from that day forward, the bullying stopped. Lila didn't suddenly become Ava's best friend, but she no longer tormented her. Slowly, the culture at the school began to shift. Other kids, inspired by Ava's courage, began to stand up for themselves and for each other. Ava's journey wasn't just about winning a race or standing up to a bully. It was about discovering her own strength and using it to create change. She had learned that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or words. They're fought within ourselves. And in the end, Ava had won the greatest victory of all. They had pushed her too far. But what they hadn't realized was that they were pushing her to become unstoppable.